So what we know at this point is that there's a difference between what the price guides are saying and what is actually happening at the market at the moment. And that's because costs have come down quite quickly. We'll look at what those trends are. But the right focus at the moment is to be looking at real costs, what's actually being incurred, because that's where the message is. In terms of trends, we're now going to turn to what building approvals are doing and things like that. I'll try and push through it fairly quickly. The idea is to get a feel for what might be coming up, what's going to happen in the next 12 months. Now, one of the key criteria I look at is building approvals. One of the reasons I look at that is because following the rising costs in the past, if you analyse it, there was like a surge in sales activity in terms of volume. Then we saw a hump in development approvals. Everyone was complaining about not enough town planners to deal with approvals. Backlog of approvals down the Gold Coast in particular. So there was this rise in that activity. Then we saw it in building approvals. Then it followed through in costs. And the disconnect between approvals and construction costs is around about a year. So it takes about a year from when the approval's occurring to when the guy with the hammer gets busy. What I've graphed here is Queensland on the left versus New South Wales and down the bottom Victoria. The reason I'm giving this is just to give you some scope of what's going on around Australia. If you read BRW, I mean, there was an article in there the other day that talked about the housing boom. And I found that pretty interesting. I'm pretty sure they were just talking about Victoria, because it's not what we're seeing in Queensland. The stats in Queensland are showing this interesting thing in red. This is non-residential building. So we had a significant drop as the GFC started to take effect. The jump back is solely because of 3 hospitals, and that's the drive. Other government expenditure, but they're projects that are in line. And we're starting to see that continue to fall at the same sort of trend. The green line is residential building. And again, we've had a significant fall. It's hidden behind here, but we're starting to see a nice turn in residential building. Not as strong as Victoria at all yet, and certainly not as strong yet as New South Wales. So the reason I look at this information is because I'm trying to think, if I'm a builder, what market do I want to be in? You know, Brizzy's looking a bit dodgy to me, and if I wanted to be in a market that's on growth, I'd be looking at New South Wales, and I'd want to be positioning in that sort of area. So in terms of those trends, for Queensland, it's pretty flat. The other indicators, the dashboard, if you like, that I look at is what's going on with houses, and here I'm targeting Brisbane and Ipswich and Caboolture as one area, and then I'm comparing it to the Sunny and the Gold Coast. This one here is about apartments in Brisbane within 5 k's of the CBD, just looking at what approvals are happening there. And then we'll look at infrastructure and mining. So in housing approvals, Brizzy's actually getting quite strong. But all the activity is actually in Ipswich. There's hardly anything. Brisbane is quite flat. So we're mainly looking at Ipswich as the driver of that, and then followed by Caboolture. And it's starting to strengthen quite well. It's early days, and it's not as high as what we'd seen in recent times, and certainly not as high as or as strong as what we saw in 2003. But it's a good sign. It's probably the only one we've got. In terms of apartment approvals, this red line is Brisbane, and the green line is Gold Coast. For Gold Coast, I look at the strip, so I'm mainly looking at the beach suburbs. And really, the approvals, well, the Gold Coast had approvals this quarter, I think, of 0. And it had some the quarter before, and the one before that was 0. So it's really falling away in its approval statistics. In Brisbane, we had a kick, and it looked like that might have been building, but then now it's flattened and it's falling away. And largely, they're the projects that you'll start to see coming out of the ground. And it's going to be interesting for, like one of those is, there's a number of them around, things like Code, but probably the more noticeable one will be as you come from the airport, you're going to see the Divine Leighton job at Hamilton there, and it's going to feel like there's activity. You're going to start seeing cranes going up around the city. And this is where we have this wave of activity. The thing is the cranes are going to go up, and using the Joh Bjelke-Petersen type of scale, a lot more cranes in the sky is a great sign, but the thing is there's nothing behind it. There's not a wave in sales or approvals that's driving it. It's more the projects that have been on hold and are now coming to the market. So it's sort of jobs that have been held up for whatever reason. So that's sort of the story in apartments. Highways and subdivisions and then mining. The real message here is the difference between the blue line, which is what our contractors think they're going to build, and what they're actually building, which is the red line. This sector never builds what it says it does. This is before the mining tax. And it comes down to even the way they build. Looking at a project in Gladstone recently, they said, oh, we're going to bring a component in. The component was a building the same size as a ship. So it's being fabricated outside of Queensland and brought here. So the cost structure is quite different. The effect on the ground can be different. But it's a real thing. So when people talk about, hey, labour's moving to the mines, yes, that's happening, but it may not be as significant as how we're told. The levels of activity down here in red are nowhere near what you would have believed if reading the papers as to what's going on. And you couldn't have more yellow trucks and cranes and stuff around Brisbane CBD. There's no way that this activity is going to get more than what we've seen. So what I'm looking at is that even though expectations are high, it's interesting they're now dropping, and the actual activity itself is starting to fall away. The stimulus package, just something else that we need to cover off on to get a scope of where we're at in the overall. Largely, it's going to be completed by around about March this year in terms of its effect. This data down the bottom comes from the government website. It's hard to get data on their stuff. This is actually from December last year, which is a bit late. I think by the time they update it, it'll all be done. So it's hard to get an idea of where they're going to. This green line is what they talk about being completed, and the purple is what they say is yet to do. This is the Building Education Revolution work, so that's all the schools, and this is the social housing work down here. Where that is at the moment is the schools will basically be done by March, and the bulk of the social housing is going to be done by December this year. So again, we're going to have this wave of activity come through, but then we'll see it settle. In terms of costs, and looking at what they've done, and we'll look at it in two ways. We'll look at what's been the effect on subdivisions and what's been the effect on buildings. You've seen, those of you that have been to these talks before, you will have seen this graph where I'm plotting the consumer price index in relation to the building price index and monitoring how they fluctuate together. Where we're at the moment is we've had this significant fall in costs. A lot like what we saw in 91, 92. And we know from looking at this data over the period that we've been looking at it since 1970 that the only time prices fall is when the economy fails. So when it's not performing is when that follows through to construction costs. When we look at what those shifts were, in 2008, prices netted off at around about an increase of 2.6%. If you look at the actual data, there was a high level of price rise up until about September, October that year. And if you were unlucky enough to enter into a contract in September, you probably will have paid the highest price around, because then prices started to fall, and they started to fall significantly. And in 2009, I reckon we saw falls of around about 12%. Now, depending on who you look at and which indexes you follow, you're going to see different numbers there, but it's still going to be in the order of 10%. Where I think we are this year, between January and June, is we've continued to fall in the building side, and there's been a fall of about 2.3% so far. In terms of subdivisions, it's just been delayed a bit, and that's largely because it's been held up by infrastructure work. What we're looking forward to in subdivisions is a bit like what we've seen in building, the big guys coming down into the lower markets, and that's going to make it tough. It's going to make it tough, particularly in the subdivision area. So where I think costs are going to go, I think for the rest of this year, in terms of houses, the building side of things, I think it's going to be flat. In terms of subdivisions, I think there's more to come off there. It might be as much as 4%, but it's going to get more competitive. Next year, I'm just putting in a slight rise in the construction, in the building side of things. It's only because of this interest that might be building up in housing, and I've just got to watch how it plays out. But the end result is it's not going to be much of a change at all. 2% is neither here nor there. All I'm kind of indicating there is there's a possibility of increase, but we'll just keep an eye on it. In terms of subdivisions, I think it'll be pretty flat in terms of the civil costs. So what we now know is we've got an understanding of where prices are at. So we know in our townhouse example that they're around about $1,309 a square metre, and we know that in looking forward to the next 12 months that that's likely to hold. That's likely to be about the same sort of price. So when we turn to that FISO and we start running it out again, so we've got the same parameters, we've just adjusted the cost to $1,309. We're now at a return of almost 12%. The challenge now becomes how do we start to drive that further? How do we get down to $1,200 a square metre, and is it possible? So that's where the solution lies. Before we do that, I want to explain to you two things. One's a methodology of how to use real costs, how to make it work for you, and the other one is some technology and the things that are changing in our market that enable these exercises to be turbo boosted, if you like. And it doesn't matter what type of project you're looking at. It doesn't matter whether it's houses or whether it's subdivisions or whether it's offices. This same methodology applies through all of them. This one here is called scratch pad estimating. Now again, you're not going to be able to read the information there or make a lot of sense out of it, but where this comes from is in '83, when I started in the business, my old man and his partner, Bruce McCracken, used to work a lot with FA Pigeon. And their estimator there was a fella called John Maxwell. And John I used to sit there and watch them, and they'd negotiate costs, and they'd almost do estimates on the back of a packet of cigarettes. And it was based on what the costs that they'd done on the last project. And it was just bizarre how it played out. But anyway, that was how it was done. That was when we started collecting information. So we've been collecting information all through that period. We've got something like about 11,000 different cost records on projects across all sorts of things. Being able to analyse and use that data is the important skill. One thing is to see it, the next thing is to analyse it, and the next thing is to be in a position to be able to use it. My partner, Richard Mason, and I developed this scratch pad estimating system in around about early 90s. And what we do is it allows us to tick and flick between costs. These columns relate to those schedules that we were looking at the beginning. So they're the project costs lined up, and we're looking at them elementally. So we're able to tick and flick between the ones that we want to use. We can avoid the jobs that have got bad ground conditions because we know this site has got good ground conditions. We can recalculate the averages and see where it is. If we want to, we can do calculations in terms of actual prices to try and get a guide on whether those costs are near. The thing to avoid is using rules of thumb and guesses at rates, because you always come up with the same answer. If you sit there and you say, hey, a slab costs $220 a square metre and a roof costs $280 a square metre, you use that same methodology. The only thing that changes is the area. So what you need to have is the ability to be able to chop and change and use actual costs between jobs. And it allows you to use your gut still in what you're doing.